All right. Well, good morning or good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Tradecraft Tuesday. Today, the topic is investigating macOS malware using open source tools. That's kind of a specific topic to what we're going to be covering because we're going to be touching on a lot of different things today, Patrick and myself. So quickly, my name is Stuart Ashenbrenner. I'm a staff macOS researcher here at Huntress. And of course, I'm joined by Patrick Wardle, who's the founder of Objective-C. Patrick, if you want to give an introduction to yourself for people who may not know.
Sure, yeah. My name is Patrick Wardle. I am the founder of the Objective-C organization. Super stoked to be here with Stuart today. We kind of go way back. Pretty much, I'm obsessed with all things Mac security related, and I think we'll dive into some of the tools and efforts that the Objective-C nonprofit organizes and puts on. But again, super stoked you're all joining here. And Stuart, thanks again for having me on the webinar today.
Oh, the pleasure is ours. So just to give kind of a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today, there's quite a few things. Most of this is not going to be like in slide form like this. We're going to have a few here at the top to kind of set the scene. And then it's just going to be kind of a conversation between myself and Patrick. So I'm going to talk about a few things here, which you can see. So we'll go ahead and dive in because you're freshly coming off Objective by the CV6, which happened in Spain this year, which is super awesome. There was a lot of stuff. I do want to get to your talk and what I found so interesting about this, but first, I'll stop sharing here. But I'm curious, Patrick, kind of just the a recap of Objective by the Sea, how it went. I wasn't able to attend this year, which is so unfortunate. I was at the first one and a few of the others, but wasn't able to make it. So just kind of maybe a recap on how it went.
Sure. So Objective by the Sea is our Mac security conference. Basically, the idea maybe 6, 7 years ago, we were wondering, hey, like how can we connect more with the community? And where are there some gaps? And whereas there were Windows specific conferences, there's lots of cybersecurity conferences that maybe had one or two Mac talks. There really wasn't one dedicated specifically to Apple security topics. And so we said, hey, we should organize this. And so in 2018, I believe was the 1.0, Stuart, that's where I actually met you for the first time, which is great. We had this very small kind of intimate conference where I didn't know if anyone was going to show up, but we had, maybe 80 or 90 people, which was amazing. And since then, it's kind of blossomed really into this community focused event. So as you mentioned, we just wrapped up version 6.0. This year it was in Spain. Basically, what we do is we do every other year in the US, Hawaii, and then alternate years in Europe, just because they're far apart and it's easier for people to travel to the more local ones. Yeah, so this was the biggest and best so far. I know a lot of people here in this webinar were there, which is amazing. We had 250 or so people. We try to keep it kind of that size. We could grow, but we also like, kind of keeping it a little more intimate. Logistically, that's easier. But then also, it makes it more of a community focused event where after the talks, you can approach the speakers, you can chat with friends. Just that size resonates really well. We're lucky enough to have incredible speakers. Ian Beer from Google comes and gives a talk on, the latest iOS threats. Lots of other individuals, top tier researchers in the Mac and iOS security scene come to speak, which is great. We also have a lot of students that the organization provides their travel, pays for lodging, pays for them to take trainings, and also attend the conference, which is great because for most of these students, this is their first foray into a cybersecurity event. And we think it's really neat that they can start with OBTS and connect with a lot of people they've looked up to, perhaps companies that are hiring. So really, really, really amazing event, an opportunity. And for me and for Andy, Andrea, my coworker, my colleague who helped organize the event as well, it's just such an incredible event because, yeah, it's a lot of work, but there's so many friendly faces that we see almost every year who come help us both, just by being there, but who offer to help organize the conference, help with any loose ends, and so it feels really great to see everyone. So at the end, yes, it's an incredible conference with tons of amazing technical research that's being presented, but my favorite part is really the community that comes together and being able to hang out with many of my peers and a lot of my really good friends.
Yeah, that's great. I found that your conference is very intimate, and maybe part of that's like the macOS security community in general. But
Sure.
like you said, you see a lot of the same people. You get to catch up. Um, it's 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 so fun to be there because you get to see the same people who you haven't gotten to see in a year. Um,
Yeah.
Cool. I do want to dive into one of the talks you gave. Before we do, I just want to mention if anyone has questions as we go along, we'll either address them as we go or we'll collect them and answer them at the end. Just make sure you change your chat to the host and panelists drop down. So you gave a talk on BTM, which is the background task management. It's like the governance of persistence items. And in years past and in past OSs, a lot of the persistence has been based around a handful of different directories for launch daemons, launch agents at the root level and user level. And you have these different directories kind of spread all over the system. However, in the recent OS, those have kind of all been packaged into one file, for lack of a better term, in this kind of P list. And you spoke about this P list, this binary P list, as well as kind of a 0-day or an exploit that you found looking through that, as well as kind of looking at how endpoint security taps into that. So I'm
Sure.
curious. I know part of this plays into some of your tools, as well as you wrote a new tool kind of about this particularly. But kind of what drew your attention to the BTM database in the first place, as well as like kind of digging into that more and looking how it interacts with endpoint security.
Yeah, great question. I'm going to start with a little bit of a step back to talk about, why we even care about this in the first place. So my main passion is probably studying, analyzing Mac malware. And Mac malware, you might have seen Stuart mention this in the promo video, it's becoming ever more prolific. And this is simply because, well, Macs themselves are becoming more popular. Hackers are very opportunistic. And so, if most people are using Macs, especially in the enterprise, we see a big uptick there. It's really no brainer for hackers and malware writers to really start paying more attention to macOS. It's just the unfortunate reality. Now, what we're seeing are all these kind of disparate types of malware. We're seeing ransomware, we're seeing cryptocurrency miners, we're seeing nation state backdoors that use 0 days to exploit Macs. But there's this kind of commonality with most of them, and that is that they persist. And what I mean by persistence is the mechanism by which the malware will install itself so that when the system is rebooted, it gets automatically relaunched. And you can imagine if malware didn't persist and you rebooted your system, well, it wouldn't get re-executed. So in some senses, you would have essentially just disinfected yourself. So malware authors, regardless of their backgrounds, if they're cyber criminals, if they are nation state adversaries, once they get initial code execution on your Mac or a Mac, a victim's Mac, they're going to persist. So what we can do is we can focus on that persistence event as a mechanism to uncover malware, maybe generically. It's really like a good subset of items on your system. It's a good place to start because there will be legitimate items that persist. For example, Zoom persists a auto updater component. But if you look at all the persistent items on your machine, there's probably like 20 of them. There's probably not a ton. And if there is any malware on your system, it's likely going to be in that list as well. So instead of like just randomly digging around looking for it, it's a really good place to look. It's a very small haystack to look for a very big needle. And as Stuart mentioned in the past, it was difficult for both users and security tools that went to enumerate persistence because you really had to look all over the operating system. So there's a variety of ways to persist, but these were all totally disparate and they weren't organized. Starting with macOS 13, I believe, Apple decided, hey, we should kind of organize this. So what they did is they created this new subsystem called the Background Task Management Subsystem, or BTM. And what BTM does is simply organize persistent items. Currently, it's focused on login items and launch items. Launch items include launch agents and launch daemons. And if you look at the vast majority of Mac malware that persists, almost all of it, 90% plus, I would say, anecdotally, persists using one of those three techniques. So again, login items or launch agents and daemons. And before, you had to go look over here for login items. You had to go look over here for launch agents, many places for launch daemons. It was difficult. And we could write tools that could do that. But what Apple did is now nicely take them and organize them into the background task management database. The problem is this is totally undocumented. So I think we'll talk about this in a little bit. I write some tools that show, for example, everything that's persisted on your system. Again, this is a great way to see if there's any persistent malware on your system. And I said, okay, well, now Apple, the operating system, has this list, this database. Like, I want my tool just to read that, and then I can display that to the user, or I can grab that programmatically and then, for example, pass that on to another security tool that then might go through that list of items, which again is going to largely include legitimate items, and go through and provide, or rather examine them and say, hey, of these 12, 20 items, are any of them suspicious? So the first step was to figure out how the subsystem works. So I spent some time reverse engineering what happens when the user installs an item that persists. For example, they install Zoom. Zoom is going to install I believe it's a launch daemon. In the background, BTM picks up on this event, puts this in the database, and then also gives you an alert saying, hey, Zoom installed an item that is automatically running. So again, this is another part of BTM. It alerts the user as to the fact that something persists, which is good from a security point of view. That's informative. So it turns out we've been kind of talking about this database. It's a binary property list, which isn't really that much of a problem. But if we dig into it a little bit deeper, what the background task management subsystem does is basically takes metadata about each persistent item. So Zoom's launch daemon, any malware that's on your system that's persistently installed, and then does something called serialization, which basically creates an object in memory and then writes that out. The problem is if you look at the database, you basically have these serialized objects, which are essentially useless in their serialized form. Like you can't just run an SQL query and say like, give me a name of all the items. They're basically encoded, they're serialized. So what I did, I was reverse engineered how the various components of the background task management subsystem interacted with that database, because they can obviously read and deserialize those items. And I found what I could do was access the database directly, load its serialized contents into memory, and then I could actually take the background task management daemon, load it into my process space, kind of like a library, which actually works, and then call into the background task management daemon's methods to basically say, hey, please deserialize the objects for me. And this works really well. This is kind of like, in a way, how it would do it normally. I've just kind of add the step of me asking for it. And the end result is I get a nice deserialized object about every item that is stored in this BTM database. And then once I have these items, as I mentioned, include information, metadata about each persistent item. We can do things like extract their names and their paths and their code signing information. What we can then do is take that and examine those. So for example, if there is an item called Zoom installed, we can check the code signing information and we can see, okay, this is installed by or signed by Zoom proper. Okay, that's legit. But we might see something that is running, for example, from a hidden directory, or something whose name is com.apple.software updater. And we might say, okay, this is probably Apple's software updater, but we can, now that we have the path, go check the code signing information of that item. And if it is not signed by Apple proper, that's a huge red flag. It's basically something masquerading, likely malware, as a core operating system component. So being able to parse the contents of BTM, the background task management database, is really a critical step in detecting any persistent malware. And again, you want to focus on persistence when detecting malware. So the tool I wrote is a simple library. Basically, you can either run it from a terminal tool. It just dumps everything to standard out. You can also link it into your own tools. Basically, make a call that says, hey, parse the database, and I'll give you back then a nice dictionary with all the persistent items, with all their metadata nicely extracted. So again, their path, team IDs, names, and from that, then you can examine those more. So this is great. Again, really appreciate in the sense that Apple built this database for us. It would have been nice if they documented that, but that's fine. It gives us something to talk about. But there are some issues with background task management. So one of the things I mentioned, the other thing it does, besides just organizing persistence items, is it will alert the user when a persistent item is added. This is great because imagine the user browses to a website or opens a Word document. If that's a malicious website or a malicious Word document, it might have a payload that persistently installs some backdoor. Because again, most malware is going to persist. Well, now if that happens, even if they were using zero-day exploits to get initial code execution, there will be an alert from the operating system saying, hey, something just persisted. And again, if you're installing something legitimate like Zoom, you'd be like, yeah, that's fine, no problem. But again, if you just opened a Word document and you get that pop-up, that's a big red flag that something is likely amiss. So that's good. Also, the background task management delivers what is known as an endpoint security message. And endpoint security is a subsystem, a framework that Apple has developed recently that allows security tools to register for certain events. And in theory, that's great. So now not only can I dump the database, I can actually, in theory, listen for events so that when something is persisted, I get a real-time notification, which allows me to perhaps build more proactive defense tools or security tools. So I wanted to dig into that because Apple's pushing this as like, hey, this is a great security tool, kind of solves all of your issues. But when I dug into it, it turned out that while that kind of worked, it would be very easy for malware to really bypass both the alert that's sent to the user and also bypass the endpoint security message. So in other words, malware could still persist in a way that was completely silent, which is kind of problematic because if Apple is saying, hey, we have this new security feature, it'll alert you when there's persistence events, you might then say, okay, awesome, this is great. This means if anything persistently installs itself, I will get an alert, the user will get an alert, and my security tool will get a notification. So if that actually works, that's awesome. But if that's not the case, you can kind of have a false sense of security. So I dug into that and I found a few issues. First, you can actually reset the database. And if you do that, it will automatically get rebuilt on the next reboot and everything will still persist as normal. So it won't break any functionality. But when you reset the database from then on until a reboot, if you persist anything, the item will persist and run, but no notification will get sent to the user. I don't know exactly why. I didn't really dig into that, but it appears that they don't quite handle resetting the database fully. Now, you need root permissions to do that. So I also wanted to say, is there a way where an adversary could persist and prevent the notification even if they don't have root permissions? And it turns out super easy to do. What you can simply do is send a signal, a sleep signal, to the agent that's responsible for showing the event to the user. Any process can send it an event running as user permissions, so you don't need any special permissions. And you can basically say, hey, please go to sleep. Once the agent is asleep, you go and persist your malware. That will register with the background task management database, so it'll be automatically restarted every time. This is good. This is what we want. The BTM subsystem will send a message to the agent saying, hey, please inform the user that something was persisted. However, the agent is sleeping. We put it to sleep. And so that message never gets delivered. So you can persist all the items you want. There will be no alerts to the user. Unfortunately, there was still the BTM endpoint security message that was also delivered. So those are kind of two separate things. So I said, okay, we found a way to defeat the alert that's shown to the user. Can we also defeat the endpoint security message? Because that's actually the one that's probably more problematic for malware, because if there is a security software installed on the system listening for these events, it's probably going to take a very close examination anytime something persists. So I looked into it, and it turns out that they don't handle the situation where a process performs a persistence event and then exits very quickly. So a lot of malware will use shell commands to persist. For example, they will copy a property list into, for example, the launch agent directory, which is how you persist. Background task management will pick that up. Endpoint security will go then and try to look at what process was responsible for persisting the item to alert the user and also deliver the endpoint security message. But if that process has exited already, for example, if it's a shell command, CP, blah, 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 property list, blah, 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 launch agents, the endpoint security framework is not going to find that process anymore because it's exited, it's gone, and will error out and will not actually deliver the message. So again, this provides a mechanism to basically bypass or break background task management. And I saw this flaw and I said, okay, how do I trigger that? Do I have to write a proof of concept? And it actually, no. So some of the tools I write have persistent components because they are security tools, so they need to be running. And I persist using some shell commands. So for example, I copy, blocks, launch daemon, property list using the CP command. It's just easier, right? You can do it from a script. So I simply ran block, and I observed the fact that it inadvertently triggered the flaw in the endpoint security system, which would basically bypass the endpoint security message. So in a nutshell, I've kind of been rambling about this for a while. BTM is a great step in the right direction. It's awesome that now Apple is kind of collecting all the persistence events into one location. This makes it really awesome for people who are writing third-party security tools. But the way Apple is currently doing it, their messaging components are fraught with some pretty serious issues. So it's often the case, this is a step in the right direction, but we should, in my opinion, never solely depend on Apple's security and messaging, because once you take a closer look at them, they're often really easy to bypass. And I have a lot of experience, analyzing things, reverse engineering. I do have a propensity for, breaking Apple stuff, but it would be naive and arrogant to think that I'm the only person that can do that. So obviously, if I can figure this out, no doubt that hackers, malware authors, nation states can also find this out. They are way better funded, have way bigger teams, and are way more, I would say, motivated. So again, it's really important for us to point out these flaws and then tell Apple about them, because otherwise we're left with this false sense of security, believing maybe Apple's security mechanisms are all that we need. So BTM, amazing, but areas for improvement.
Yeah, I think one of the really fascinating parts about BTM, and this kind of goes to one of the questions I see that came in asking if Jamf Protect accesses or uses BTM, like the database. And to kind of answer that in a roundabout way, I would imagine they do, only because with like the release of BTM, another thing Apple did was basically say, you don't have to put your launch daemon inside of the library launch daemon directory or inside of the user's library launch item or launch agents directory. You can actually have it within your application bundle. So in your whatever it is. The reason I address this towards Jamf Protect is I know one of a Jamf tool, I don't remember which one, actually does this, where it's tool.app inside your applications directory, contents / I think it's library / launch daemon, and you can actually have your launch daemon living within your app bundle. And BTM will notice that and parse that as well, which is great, because if you're constantly looking at just those primary locations, there's a good chance you might miss a launch item that's living within one of those app bundles. So moving to this sort of monitoring, I think is a great step by Apple as far as security is concerned.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And one of the main reasons BTM was introduced is, as Stuart mentioned, you can now have your persistent items in your application bundle. Before, you kind of had to copy them out into some user or system directory. And so now, because they can essentially be in any app bundle anywhere, it's really nice for BTM to manage all that stuff. So yeah, hopefully security tools are using that. When I published my research in this tool, there was no public discussion of the database itself or the internals. But hopefully security tools are also moving toward this. Apple also is making some improvements. I filed a whole ton of bug reports because some of the endpoint security alerts, even though we showed how to bypass, they didn't even really work that well normally. So the first one that was supposed to give you a notification anytime an item was persisted, instead of telling you what item was persisted, it would just give you the entire list of everything that was persisted. So anytime a new item came into the system, you would get like inundated. So again, I was like, Apple, I don't think this is how you meant to do this. Like, don't give me the whole database. Just tell me what the new item was added. And so I actually updated some of my tools to use the endpoint security messaging, but then, I've held off until Apple has improved that, because as they were released, I don't think Apple actually tested them or really thought about the use cases of this. Like, kind of had an idea and just, I think, shipped it. And then it's unfortunately often up to us to go back and say, hey, when there's a new persistence event, it doesn't make sense for you to give me a list of everything that's already installed. Just give me the new event. Like, I think that's probably what you intended. And then Apple was like, oh, yeah, it goes back, new version of the operating system is released, and hopefully eventually it gets fixed.
And
The
those are all
life of
still
security
open?
tools. I think, no, the one where it reported the entire list has now been fixed. They also didn't send a notification when login item was added. I believe they fixed that. But the remove event doesn't work. You just get no notification. Maybe they fix that. I I file a bug report and I'm like, come on, please fix. Unfortunately, then I don't have a lot of time to go and like Q&A Apple's fixes. So I just make a lot of noise and say, okay, I pointed out the problem. Like, I'm doing free Q&A. Like, please just fix it and make this work.
Well, and you bring up reports and things like that. And you had another talk at OBTS where you talked about
Yeah.
crash reports and the importance of understanding those.
Mm.
I found that an incredibly fascinating talk, because it's something that I think a lot of people will see, like program crashes, they see the crash report, they hit okay, and they move on with their day. But you kind of went into detail about how to understand crash reports, how important it is for developers to know why their software is crashing and things like that.
Sure.
I'm curious if this idea stemmed from personal, you like trying to develop your own software and not understanding why things were occurring, and trying to like backtrace through your own crash reports, or if it's
Sure.
something that you've observed just by being a researcher and understanding kind of the more internals of macOS.
Yeah, I'm glad we're talking about this, because crash reports are generally thought of just like this an annoyance in a sense. Well, it's annoying when something crashes and generates a crash report, and you're just like, ugh, great, this app crashed, sucks, kind of thing. But it turns out that crash reports should be like your best friends, right? You should really love them for a variety of reasons. One, if you're a user and you're using an app and it crashes, in order to get that bug fixed, the developer is probably going to need a crash report, because a crash report has the details about why the application crashes. So I use some third-party tools, for example, disassemblers, all sorts of other tools. And when they crash, I found if I email the developer or submit a bug report to the company with a crash report, that bug gets fixed a lot quicker versus saying, hey, it just crashed, I was doing this, this, and this. Like, that really isn't that helpful. And I've actually been on the other end as a developer myself. I'd like to think my tools never crash, but the reality is they do. And whenever users like, hey, I think this crashed, I'm always like, send me the crash report. And when they do, a lot of times it's very easy for me to say, oh yeah, look, I made this assumption. Apple, pushed out an update, broke that assumption. My tool didn't handle that as gracefully as it should have, and it should crash. And that's usually very apparent in the crash report. The users, crash reports are beneficial for getting apps fixed. Developers, they're essential. But what to me is the most interesting thing about crash reports is their use in the context of security tools. And I can't claim credit for this idea. This is something that many other people have talked about. And in my slides in the talk, I actually focused on a really interesting case study that Microsoft published in 2008. So what Microsoft was doing, even back then, is anytime a system-level daemon or component of Windows would crash, that crash report would get sent back to Microsoft. I don't know if the user had to click, submit or something, but there was basically a stream of these reports coming in. And Microsoft rightfully made the observation that most of these crashes are going to be from, an issue in the operating system, but there could be a small percentage of crashes that are due to failed exploits. So most exploits trigger what are known as memory corruption vulnerabilities, which is a buffer overflow, a heap overflow, corrupting a pointer, something along those lines. And those exploits, those vulnerabilities, yes, they're very powerful, but they're not 100% reliable. And most of the security mechanisms now built into the operating system, like ASLR, non-executable stacks, pointer authentication, these are all exploit mitigations that will cause a crash if a memory corruption exploit is attempted and isn't written in the perfect way. And so what Microsoft did, again, back in 2008 already, they started looking through these crash reports, looking for signs of failed exploitation. And we don't have time to go into all the details of that, but basically note that when a program crashes because of a failed exploitation attempt, that's going to generally look different than an application that crashed because it has some, simple, some operating system issue. So what Microsoft did is, they started looking through this, and in 2008, they found 2 crashes, and they always ranked their crashes by how common they were. And so this was crash number like 45,000, because again, they're getting millions of these. But they looked at this one, and again, they found 2 crash reports, and they looked at it, and they figured out that it was crashing from a failed exploitation attempt. They went and looked at where in the code it was crashing, went and audited that code, and found out that it was a remote zero-day vulnerability that a sophisticated hacker group had found and was using to infect user systems around the world. It's fully remote. The user didn't have to click on anything, worked on all versions of Windows, and gave you system access. Like, these are the dreams, right? These are the most powerful exploits. And again, it was zero-day. Memory corruption vulnerability. So it was, 99.9% reliable. But in those cases that it crashed, Microsoft eventually got a copy of the crash report, figured out that there was this zero-day that was being actively exploited, pushed out a patch, and then protected Windows users around the world. So crash reports, really powerful. Also, malware can trigger crashes. For example, Lockbit, it's a very prolific ransomware group, recently started to develop a version that would run natively on Apple Silicon systems. Again, kind of goes back to what we said earlier, where Macs are becoming super prolific. Makes sense that the ransomware groups start building versions of their tools, their malicious creations that can run natively on Mac systems. So Lockbit's Mac payload, I tested it, ran pretty well. But every now and again, it would crash. They basically had a flaw in their code, which would generate a crash report. If you were monitoring crash reports, you could see that something had crashed. And then when you looked at what that something was, you would be like, wait a minute, why is there this unnotarized piece of software, running perhaps from a hidden directory that's trying to encrypt user files? Big red flags. The crash report is what kind of pointed you in the right direction. We also see malware crash as Apple adds new security mechanisms. So for example, TCC access, checks, notarization requirements. If you don't fulfill certain of these requirements, which a lot of a malware doesn't, if the malware doesn't handle that correctly, it might crash. Again, crash reports can provide us a signpost or guidance that, hey, perhaps something is amiss. Finally, we can also use crash reports to find our own issues, our own security bugs, I should say. So I write a lot of tools, and then sometimes these tools crash. Some of the time, it's my fault, but a surprising percentage of the time, it's actually because my tools have inadvertently triggered flaws or issues in Apple's framework or even the kernel. So I talked about BlockBlock's installer that inadvertently triggered an issue with the endpoint security subsystem, which would trigger an error, which would prevent a endpoint security message from being delivered. While some of my other tools have triggered what have turned out to be security issues. So one of the tools I write detects ransomware, and a previous version did that by using some relatively unknown, underutilized APIs that Apple provides. So I ran my tool, went surfing, came back, and my system had panicked. It had crashed. When my system panics or crashes, I always get excited. It's annoying that everything like shut down. But I dug into it, and it turned out that my tool, by just calling into these APIs, doing nothing malicious, I wasn't fuzzing it. I'm just using the APIs according to the documentation, triggered this really interesting kernel vulnerability that caused a panic. And it turned out this kernel vulnerability had some neat security implications. And within that same chunk of code, there was actually another bug that would have provided an attacker the ability to gain arbitrary kernel execution via a pretty reliable heap overflow. Again, I could figure this all out by the crash reports that were generated. So I thought it was an interesting topic to dive into because crash reports have so many use cases, and I don't think we're utilizing that. So I just wanted to shed some light on that. Microsoft are obviously using that. Maybe Apple is too. Apple doesn't really talk about what they do, but I think there's some interesting opportunities for us to gain some really valuable information from these reports, which are often, in my opinion, overlooked.
Yeah, and you bring up an interesting point, and I kind of want to pivot to this a little, but about malware that will crash and things like that. And I'm curious on your take on kind of what the current state of Mac malware is. I still see a ton of adware, like the ad load, Pirit, and things like that. And there's obviously been some pretty sophisticated things going on we've seen this year. Just I think a week ago, Jamf Threat Labs talked about that Blue Noroff group again, and some of the interesting things that are going on. I'm curious, and especially as a lot of people who are involved with Huntress or run Huntress or whatever it is are usually in that small to medium-sized business,
Sure.
IT shop, things like that. I'm curious what your take is, both from small adware to like the Dazzle Spy, Sandbox Escape, like kind of where you kind of see the current state of Mac malware right now.
Yeah, I love talking about that because we've really seen some interesting changes. I mean, the Mac malware space is evolving rapidly. Finally, and I say finally as like someone who gets excited about new Mac malware. As a Mac user, not so stoked. So if we back up, say even 10 years ago, the malware then was like super basic, usually required user interaction, was super poorly written, was like basically looked like hackers were like, oh, I need to learn how to write malware on Mac, and like amateurs at it. Fast forward to today, the landscape has just drastically changed. So kind of goes without saying, but worth repeating that, gone are the days that Macs don't get malware, right? So I have this screenshot of Apple's website from 2012, and it says Apple's or Macs, OS X at the time, OS 10, don't get Windows viruses. They're free from all of this. And that's, the nuanced keyword there is like Windows viruses, because it's like, well, yeah, of course, a Mac isn't going to get a Windows virus. But that actually wasn't even true at the time. There were some cross-platform viruses that could run on both Windows and Mac. So that statement, even though maybe was technically true in a court of law, was massively misleading. But at the time, sure, right? You would fire up your Windows XP box, connect to the internet, and get owned by like Configure or like Code Red or something, and everyone's Windows systems were just getting owned. Macs, on the other hand, you would fire up and like hackers weren't even paying attention, and so like you wouldn't get that infected. Fast forward to today, kind of some interesting trends we've seen. So at the end of each year, I really kind of look at all the new malware of the year, and I don't focus on adware too much because there's too much of that. And so over the last few years, really seeing some interesting trends. I believe it was in 2020. 50% of the new malware targeting macOS actually existed already on other platforms, either on Windows or Linux. And what hackers had done was either rewrote that for macOS or directly ported it over using cross-platform frameworks. And if we put ourselves in the hacker's shoes, this is a no-brainer, right? They already have command and control infrastructure set up. They already have protocols written, set up for their Windows and Linux payloads. So yeah, if they make a Mac version and get it to run on Mac system, well, they've just vastly increased the number of systems that they can target. If you think of like a ransomware group or adware, right? The more victims you have, the better, right? There's more money, more financial gain. So it's really interesting to see that trend. Not surprising to me because, again, Macs are becoming massively popular everywhere. But it was interesting to see that hackers and adversaries are basically making their existing malicious creations cross-platform. So that was one interesting trend. Another interesting trend we've seen is just the increase of sophistication in terms of malware. So again, previously it like sucked. There really isn't a better way to describe that. But now it's like impressively good. Now it's not as good as the Windows malware, but that begets the question: are we just not detecting the Windows, the Mac equivalent of the really sophisticated stuff because maybe our security tools aren't as good? But I really think, generally speaking, malware on macOS is not that sophisticated compared to Windows. But it's still sophisticated compared to where it was and is pretty decent. For example, you mentioned Dazzle Spy. Dazzle Spy was an interesting piece of malware from 2 or 3 years ago that was used to target pro-democracy advocates in Hong Kong. So you can probably guess who was behind that. And it was sophisticated for a variety of reasons. One, it used zero-day vulnerabilities to infect users when they would browse to a website. So that's pretty sophisticated. We traditionally didn't see a lot of zero-day vulnerabilities being used in Mac malware. And then also had a sandbox escape, a kernel component. So all pretty sophisticated stuff. So that's a great example. One thing though, Dazzle Spy did persist as a launch agent. So again, back to the persistence discussion, even though we might not be able to detect its 0 days and its kernel bugs, well, as soon as it persists, we could flag that and say, hey, wait a minute, this is not something that's going on. So again, persistence is key. Back to malware though, besides the increase of sophistication, we've also seen an increase in the number of new samples that are coming out. So, 2018, 2019, there'd be like 10 or 15 new variants. And these are brand new variants. It'd always be kind of like new versions that were released. And I always, throughout the year, keep like a Google Doc wherever a new one is discovered. I add it to the list. So at the end of the year, I can, dive in and produce this nice report. This year, I'm up to like 25 or 30 already. I'm just like, damn, this report is going to take a lot of time. And like you mentioned, it's, APT groups like the one Jamf, the payload Jamf discovered. It's, new adware. It's Lockbit now having macOS capabilities. It's really the whole gamut. We're just seeing like Mac being, I don't want to say inundated because Apple security mechanisms are pretty solid. And so a lot of the malware still requires some amount of user interaction. But I would say that the inundation is really like hackers' obsession with Mac. Like I would say every hacker group, every APT group now says, hey, we need to have a Mac capability. Again, this is totally unsurprising. Macs are everywhere. But that to me is an interesting trend and just says, previously, if you were a Mac user, you could kind of rest on your laurels and say, hey, I'm not as targeted as much. But now that's really, really changed. And this is revealing some interesting things in Apple's operating system because, yes, Apple has done a lot of things right, but iOS and macOS at the end of the day are computers and they're operating systems, and they are going to have flaws. So regardless of what Apple says, once nation states, APT groups, hackers really start pounding on it, they're going to find all sorts of bugs that allow malware to be installed. So what that means for us is to, always be aware of these threats, understand that Macs are now a significant target, and then take appropriate steps to mitigate the risk. Defense in depth is a good idea, but just even being aware of the fact that Macs are being seriously targeted by sophisticated malware is something that is really important. And security professionals have known this for years, but I think now the general public is starting to realize that. And just to end with one more anecdote, some of you might have followed the iOS malware that Kaspersky talked about. Basically, Kaspersky, a well-known Russian antivirus company, for the last 4 years, had been targeted with a very stealthy piece of malware that infected their employees' iPhones. And without going too much of a tangent of detecting malware on iOS, to me, it's insane that arguably the world's top antivirus company was unable to detect the fact that their phones had been infected. And this is not Kaspersky's fault. It's just that on iOS, it's very, very, very difficult to understand exactly what's going on. It's basically a black box. So if someone hacks in, like, good luck detecting that. The reason I'm mentioning that here is that after reverse engineering this iOS implant, Kaspersky figured out there were some strings and some Mac-specific capabilities. So this means whatever adversary had targeted Kaspersky undetected for almost 5 years with this incredible zero-click iOS implant, payloads, all sorts of sophisticated stuff, also has those same capabilities for Mac. So that shouldn't like scare us and keep us up at night. But again, this is just yet another example that advanced adversaries have incredibly sophisticated capabilities. And so we just need to be aware of that fact so we can hopefully take steps to make it more likely that we perhaps can detect them, or that their exploits or their malware might fail to begin with.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so we're getting quite a few or a handful of questions in the chat. Before we dive into those, because I want to leave some time for those here at the end.
Sure.
I do want to ask you quickly about Objective We that you have before kind of we move into kind of the tail end of this and OBTS 7. I can pull up a slide here, but I was just wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about what Objective We is.
Yeah, so thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about that. So I mentioned at the beginning, I'm the founder of the Objective-C Foundation, and we do a lot of, I think, super cool stuff. So we write a lot of free open source macOS security tools. I work on the Art of Mac Malware books, which are free online. And then we have the OBTS conference, which we talked about earlier. One of our main efforts, though, is also to welcome in new students, new people into the Mac community. And one reason I'm so excited about that is this is kind of a new community. So we have the ability to kind of influence both how awesome the community is, but then also how welcoming it is, especially in terms of new students and diversity. So we've created a program under the foundation called the Objective We program. And the idea is to, as I mentioned, support newcomers and also increase diversity in the tech space, right? It's no secret that the tech space is generally pretty male dominated. So there's obviously lots of opportunities to, kind of balance that out a little bit. So one of the things we do, I mentioned when I was talking about the conference, is student scholarships. So every time we do a OBTS event, we put out a student scholarship application. And what we do is we look for students who are in computer security programs at university, and then invite them to our conference, covering their flights, their hotels, allowing them to take the trainings, which are usually paid, and also then come to the conference. And this has been just super fulfilling and amazing. And the students get a ton out of it, right? The conference is pretty technical, but since they already, second, third year cybersecurity students, they, jump right in and they can understand the majority of the content. So that's super cool. The other thing that we are doing next year is we're basically starting mini OBTS events, and we're currently calling these Objective for the We. The idea is that the OBTS conference itself is amazing, but one, it's really in-depth technically. So it's great for people who are already in the industry, but for students who perhaps don't have as much experience or people brand new to it, it can be a little daunting. Also, it's like a week-long event in some amazing exotic location, which is awesome if your company's paying. But if you're a student or, again, someone who's maybe just getting into this, that is maybe a high barrier to entry. So the idea is, hey, let's do, perhaps a 2-day event in a city where there's a lot of students or people getting into this industry, and then provide both free trainings and then talks that are a little more practical, a little more hands-on. So maybe some panel discussions, maybe some, hey, how do you get started in cybersecurity? How do you begin reverse engineering Mac malware? That kind of stuff. And so in some ways, these Objective for the We events will be more tailored towards students or those kind of just coming into the macOS space, and then also act as like a a prequel for the main OBTS event. So maybe you go through the objective for the we event. You love it, you get super stoked, you have some good foundations, and then okay, now you can dive into the OBTS event. Of course, you can still show up at the OBTS event at any time. This isn't like a prerequisite. This is just something that we really thought would be great, both for the community and for the students. And since the beginning, the Objective-C Foundation really had this mindset to begin with. And one of our main things is how can we empower people in the community? And there's one story I really like, and I'll briefly talk about. So I believe it was OBTS 3. We had a woman from Ukraine submit a talk, and she was understandably like, hey, I would love to come speak at the conference. I haven't done a lot of public speaking. English isn't my first language, but this would be a great opportunity. And we agreed, and the content of her talk from a technical point of view was amazing. I was like, this would be a really great talk. The attendees at the conference would be really interested in this. This is a unique perspective. Awesome. So we reached out, we worked with her, we kind of helped her some mentorship, worked with her her talk a little bit. Awesome. She came and crushed the talk. Like, it was one of the top talks. People were super stoked at it. She had a great time. Well, who was in attendance? Apple, right? So Apple does come to our conferences unofficially. And shortly thereafter, they reached out to her and said, hey, Julia, we love what you're doing. You should, come work at Apple. And fast forward, she got accepted to work at Apple, moved from Ukraine to London. This was kind of right before the war. Huge win. And, now she has an amazing opportunity to make an incredible impact at Apple. Now, some important takeaways from this. First, all credit to her, right? She's an incredible researcher doing great work. But we were able to, through the platform of the conference and the community, just give her a platform for her to, show up and, show the world how amazing she was. That then I think opened a lot of doors. So these are the focuses. How can we, highlight people who are already doing amazing work? How can we give people opportunities that perhaps they previously weren't able to then come give talks, take trainings, give trainings, and then connect with, perhaps companies that are hiring who, either pay really well or allow you to relocate, if that's something you're interested with. So both with the Objective-C program and the OBTS events, really the idea is empowering the community. And since we're a nonprofit, this really aligns well into our mission statement.
Awesome. I want to address a couple of these questions we have in here really quick. And while we're talking about that, I will throw up this next slide. From someone in chat, they asked, one of your tools, Do Not Disturb, which is designed to prevent evil maid attacks, if I recall correctly. The ask is if it leverages BTM, and is there any chance of an Android integration of DND?
So great question. So currently the tools that use BTM are the ones that are really focused more on persistence. So that's knock knock and block block. DNT will do not disturb, DND. Same as Apple's name. That's confusing. My bad. Basically will alert you when someone opens your laptop. There's a funny story. I was in Russia out meeting with someone who turned out to work for the Russian government. Surprise, surprise. I did not know that at the time. And I was like, man, what was happening to my laptop back in the hotel room? Was someone opening it and trying to hack in and stealing all my stuff? It was a burner laptop, but still I wanted to know. And so this was the inspiration for Do Not Disturb. So Do Not Disturb is really more interested in physical access. So it doesn't have any persistence monitoring. That's something that could be added. But yeah, there does need to be both an Android and also an iOS app. The iOS app was written by a company I previously worked at, and then when we got acquired by Jamf, they decided to end of life the iOS app. So unfortunately, this means the DND will, yes, generate alerts and log things. So when you can come back, you can see if someone messed with your computer. But it'd be really neat to have a back-end mobile app. I have been looking into simple ways to do that. I wish Signal or WhatsApp had APIs, which you could basically program A could send a message and that would be delivered. Yes, you can use Apple's push notifications, but that does require a separate application. So to answer your question, currently it doesn't use any persistence monitoring. And also, yes, needs some mobile apps. And so great feature request. Maybe something I can dive into because that would definitely enhance the functionality of the of DND for sure.
And you bring up persistence monitoring, which you can do with your library that you talked about earlier, this dump
Yes,
BTM. But
exactly.
you also developed Knock Knock, which I'll kind of just run this video here of it running live. But I'm curious. This I believe was this the first tool that you wrote? Um,
Yeah, it was
okay.
kind of one of the main tools. And again, funny quick story. There's like funny anecdotes about all of these tools. So I had a friend who was like, Patrick, you do computer stuff. Come fix my computer. I'm sure all of you have been in this position, right? If you do anything computer related, you are now the IT specialist for friends and families. He was a good friend, so I went and looked at his computer, and it was a Mac. And clearly it had been infected with adware, right? So he's getting pop-ups, his homepage had been hijacked. And at the time, I just started analyzing Mac malware and researching Mac security. And so I said, okay, cool. Like what I will do is I will download a tool that shows you everything that's persistently installed. And on Windows, there's a tool called Auto Runs, which I'm super familiar with. You may as well. It's written by Internals, now Microsoft. Well, it turns out there wasn't a tool for that on Mac, which was like crazy to me. So I went home, read about some persistence techniques, wrote an embarrassingly bad Python script that would basically enumerate different persistence locations and list out what was there. Came back to his house a few days later, ran that, and it pointed out some adware components that had been persistently installed. So not only did this help then disinfect his computer, but then this really made me realize that there is a gap for these tools on macOS, right? Windows, there's a lot of great analysis tools that are, super mature, have great features. But at the time on macOS, there was not. So I decided to write Knock Knock, which tells you who's there. Amazing name, right? Very proud of this. And over the years, it's evolved to look for many pieces of persistence. So yes, now it does leverage the dump BTM library to dump everything in the background task management database. But as I briefly mentioned, BTM only currently monitors login items and launch items, which are launch agents and daemons. Turns out there are other methods, other ways that you can persist on Mac OS. So what Knock Knock does is has different plugins that go look for example, dock plugins or browser extensions. And again, the idea is if there's malware on your system and it's persisting, it should definitely show up in one of these locations, which will then give you a subset of everything that's on your Mac that then you can look. Knock Knock also integrates then with VirusTotal, sends a hash. So if it's known malware, you'll get an alert about that. Also shows code signing information. So if something is like unsigned or not notarized, you can see that as well. Again, by design, it's not saying this is malware. It's just saying this is where malware could be. And here's a small list of where you can start.
That's great. And I know we're at 11, or I guess top of the hour, but we can go a little over because I'd love to make sure we get these questions answered. And I just want to briefly ask you about a few of your other tools, because I know people even here at Huntress also run these tools like Oversight,
Okay.
which looks at your webcam or your mic, and maybe even more particularly Lulu, which is like a built a firewall essentially, and there's really not many options on Mac for something like that at least seem to be written in a native language, or are performant, I guess is the other word. But I'd love for your kind of thoughts on Lulu and what it's designed to do.
Yeah, and I love talking about these tools, and so thank you for the opportunity to dive into them. So Lulu is a firewall for macOS. So macOS has a built-in firewall that will block incoming connections, but it doesn't filter outgoing connections. So just like the majority of malware is going to persist, the vast majority of malware is also going to, at some point, connect out to a remote endpoint. So you can imagine a reverse shell that allows attacker to write commands. You can imagine something that's exfiltrating data, right? read the news. There's all these like ransomware groups that are like encrypting data and then like exfiltrating it, right? And then leaking it if the people don't pay. Nation state APT malware is going to like collect your files and exfiltrate that, maybe turn on the mic to listen to what's going on, exfiltrate that to a remote server. So much like persistence is a great thing to monitor to detect malware, so is network activities. And I was looking, and while there's some great paid options for firewalls on macOS, I'm really of the mindset that such tools should be free, at least for end users, right? In the context of businesses and the enterprise, totally different ballgame. They should pay. But end users, I think, should be free. And very quickly, I'll mention this. This is based on a variety of things, but I worked with the FBI on this case where there was interesting piece of malware called Fruit Fly, and it had remained detected for over a decade. And it was designed by an individual who would hack into Mac computers and then turn on the webcam to try to spy on users. Unfortunately, he was most interested in spying on children. So clearly a very sick individual here. The reason I'm mentioning that is if the users had a simple utility that would alert them that their webcam was on, because the malware actually would wait until the person was not sitting on the computer, because the little green light would come on. But if it's in your bedroom and you're changing in the corner, you might not see that. Where if there was a security tool that came and give you a big alert, so when you came back to your computer and be like, hey, process X was accessing the webcam, and you'd be like, wait a minute, that's really strange. That would have trivially uncovered this malware. And really, I think would have then had a positive impact in the world and prevented this pedophile from basically spying on kids. And so one of the main reasons why users don't use security software, one, Apple has unfortunately pushed the messaging, the marketing department, that Macs don't get malware. So this has left a lot of Mac users overconfident or naive about the security of their Macs, or they might not want to pay for security tools, right? Like, understandable. So I said, okay, great. Let's make some free open source tools. Anyone can audit, anyone can submit feature requests, push code, but then end users could also install in their computers. So Oversight is one example. Lulu again, I thought, look, there needs to be a free open source firewall for macOS. Yes, it's not as fancy as the paid ones, and that's fine. It's like buying a car. If you need a car to work just to get to work, you don't have a ton of money, like you don't need to go buy a Tesla, right? But if the only option was to pay for a Tesla, that would suck. So I said, okay, there needs to be like a free entry level version that does the job decently well. And yeah, if you want all the bells and whistles, you can pay. But at least there's a baseline option for users. So Lulu is probably the most popular of the Objective-C products, free open source firewall. And the idea is once it's on your system, anything that accesses the network that's not authorized, you will get an alert. And then you can quickly say, oh yeah, this is, Zoom, allow, and then it'll never alert you again. But if malware slips in, even using a 0-day vulnerability, as soon as it goes to connect out, Lulu will detect that and throw up a big alert. And then you can dig into that more and say, hey, wait a minute, this is not something I recognize.
That's awesome. Yeah, I highly recommend all the tools. Make sure you visit objective-c.com/tools, I believe is the site to get those. Two questions I see in chat before we kind of wrap things up. The first one, so I haven't had a chance to proofread these yet, so I'm reading them live, but which do you prefer for the balance of security and convenience or /convenience in the enterprise? A macOS user who is a local administrator with MDM profiles assigned, like restricted profiles, or a macOS user who's not a local admin and using like a PAM or JIT tool, use more similar to like Windows?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I don't know if I have a great answer because there's really pros and cons. I would say if you're focusing more on usability, the admin MDM solution is maybe a clear winner, again, in terms of usability. But then also provides a pretty good amount of security. So that actually might be my answer. Because unfortunately, in lower privileged environments, from a security point of view, that's kind of a no-brainer, but that like just breaks a lot of things. And it's not always the fault of the software developer. So for example, one of my tools has to monitor the logs for events. In order to monitor the logs, you have to be running as admin. And yeah, I guess you could write a tool that has like a persistent privileged component that gets super complicated. But basically that tool currently only works in an admin environment because of the prerequisites that Apple leverages that, hey, if you want to look at the log, you have to be an admin, which, yeah, to be fair, kind of makes sense. The other reason is that the MDM space, from a security point of view, if you're in a managed environment, is really the way. Apple basically has said, look, we're going to let security tools do stuff. Security tools often need a lot of access to the system. Think of a firewall, right? It's like monitoring network traffic. That means it can see packets. There's some privacy concerns there. So Apple says for end users, they're going to have to click through like 50 prompts to allow this. But if you're in an MDM environment, you can install that without bothering the user at all. So Apple has basically said, look, if you are going to be using security tools in the enterprise, we're going to make it so that works really, really well with MDM. So that's really, I think, Apple's mindset, Apple's approach. So anytime you can align yourself with Apple's approach, it's just going to cause way less pain. Now, again, purely from a security point of view, the lower privileged users might be the way to go. But I think that's just going to cause a lot of consternation. So what I've normally seen is companies go, hey, the normal user route, and then use MDM. And with MDM, they can really get a lot of the security benefits without bothering the users too much.
Awesome. Another question. Let's see. Could a defensive focus on persistence be worked around? So, example, a threat actor chooses to rely on folks rarely restarting their machine. How successful can malware be without persisting?
This is a great question because, I've really said, persistence is a great way to detect malware, but nothing is ever a panacea. And that's a great question because, well, two things. First, not all Mac malware persists. Take, for example, ransomware. It doesn't need to persist. It just shows up, encrypts all your files, and then it's like, puts a message on your, home screen or on the desktop saying like, send some Bitcoin to this address. So if you're just monitoring persistence, like ransomware doesn't even have to worry about that in the first place. To get to the question specifically, yes, especially malware that's designed to target iOS devices or servers, or even in some cases Mac, doesn't necessarily have to persist. Advanced adversaries use this for two reasons. One, they often require the highest level of stealth. They know persisting is a very observable event. It's kind of like a big red flag. So they say, okay, hey, we're not going to persist at all. And two, a lot of times if they have remote zero-click exploits, if the user does reboot the system, well, they can just infect them again. And so, yes, it's good to understand that there are ways around persistence. We haven't seen a ton, especially on macOS, doing that. But for example, on iOS, most iOS malware does not persist, because also it's very hard to persist code on, or not trusted code on iOS. But again, great question. Majority of malware does persist. There's nothing saying it has to. And so moving forward, we probably will see malware that might not persist using traditional mechanisms.
Awesome. One that's kind of speaks to your open source tools. I myself also do a lot of writing for an incident response tool for macOS. But what is the most useful way that someone can contribute to these open source projects, for example, like a plugin or something similar?
Yeah, that's a great question because we talked a lot about the open source, the Objective-C Foundation. So it's literally just me and my colleague, Andrea, and she is most involved in organizing the conference, really kind of running the organization, interacting with the students, which then frees me up to write code. But yes, all the Objective-C tools are written by yours truly. So sometimes bug reports, feature requests don't get, let's say, addressed as quickly as I should, because there's a lot of backlog, right? And so it's been great. People have, submitted pull requests, right? If there's a feature, one, it's just great when people will report bugs and feature requests on GitHub, because that's great, because then I can see a list, I can start ranking them. I slowly start working through them, but it's really great when people also submit code and pull requests and like, hey, this is a great feature. Here's the code that does that. I can review it and then merge it in. So any of those, like feature requests, bug reports, or open source contributions, are really great. The other thing is just like word of mouth, right? We're a nonprofit organization, so the more people use our tools, the word gets out there. That's great. Then companies want to sponsor and support us. So just kind of also spreading the good news is something that's super helpful, because again, it's really just me and Andrea. We don't have a social media team. We don't have a marketing team. We don't have a customer service team. So yeah, any like community support is just means the world to us and allows us to continue to focus our mission, which we're super passionate about.
That's awesome. Yeah, and that's kind of the point of these Tradecraft Tuesdays, community education, and I
Love
know
it.
Objective by the Sea is the same. So questions keep trickling in. We'll do a couple more. We'll take it like
We
a
can
couple
keep
more
going.
minutes. Uh let's see. Let me jump to any thoughts or seen issues that exploit MDM as an ingress vector or to
Oof.
establish persistence.
This is an amazing
Loaded question.
question, because MDM is now prolific in the Mac enterprises, right? It's basically like how you manage Macs and iPhones. So if you can compromise either the MDM internals of macOS or the MDM provider, essentially the third party company that's maybe managing that, like that's kind of the best way in, because I would imagine it'd be similar to like, owning the domain controller on a Windows system, or, breaking Active Directory, right? Immediately then you can access all into that. There hasn't been a ton of research on this. There was an interesting talk at OBTS a few years ago. They specifically looked at Jamf and found some areas where there were some room for improvement, let's just say, where there were some opportunities where if you could compromise a trusted component and elevate privileges, so some decent barrier to entry. But once you were in that position, you could then use the access of the MDM to propagate. So I think that in the future, we'll probably see more research into that. I'm sure advanced adversaries, nation states are looking at this very closely, because, once they're in a network, they really like to propagate. And if you can somehow find a propagation mechanism by exploiting some MDM component, like jackpot. So I think it's a super enticing attack vector for adversaries, and something that I'm sure in the future we'll see, unfortunately, more interest in. But currently, I'm not aware of a ton of research and time into that. Which isn't too surprising too. It's kind of new, and probably the adversaries that are digging into it aren't really, giving public talks about it. I mean, they can come to OBTS and give a talk, but yeah. So great question.
Great. All right, one more here, and this might be a trickier one. On iOS, were there some
Yes.
successful crash-based malware analysis? Seems like a good idea for analyzing jailed iOS.
Yeah, and this is a great question. I'm really excited about crash reports. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure, but what I have note are two cases I can point to. So there was a blog by ZecOps, which recently acquired by Jamf, and they actually found some crash reports that then they were able to analyze and found some exploitable security vulnerabilities. I believe it was like in the mail client of iOS. Now, it wasn't 100% confirmed whether these were crashing because of an exploit attempt, but in some cases, to me, that was not directly relevant, because from the crash reports, they were able to find security issues that Apple then patched and issued PDEs for, that were remote security bugs. So the crash report was like, either had detected a failed exploitation attempt, or pointed the researchers at code, at a function that contained remotely reachable code that could be potentially exploited to take over the device. The Kaspersky, the malware targeting Kaspersky that I mentioned, triangulation is what they dubbed it, had an interesting feature that once it got code execution on the box, it would delete crash logs, because their exploit wasn't 100% reliable. And so they would just try a few times. And then when they got that, the first thing they did is said, hey, we're going to clean up the crash reports, because otherwise this provides adversaries an opportunity. So the product that ZecOps had, which was interesting, it would actually pull crash reports off an iOS device, which you can do even if it's not jailbroken if you plug it in. And then they would analyze that looking for mostly failed exploitation attempts. So that's probably one of the main benefits. Malware doesn't crash that often. I mean, it shouldn't if it's been tested. Whereas remote memory corruption vulnerabilities and exploits that are designed to exploit that on modern versions of iOS, like they're unlikely to ever be 100%, which means that even the best zero-click exploits are probably going to crash sometimes. And there's really nothing the adversaries can do that. Whereas once they get on the box and install their malware is written well, or perhaps they've disabled crash reporting, they can kind of prevent that. So hopefully that answers the question. There has been some instances where exploits or vulnerabilities have been discovered on iOS, and most advanced payloads for iOS will now actually delete those because they know that can be a way that they can be found out.
Great. One last question that I have seen popping in chat that I was going to just take offline, but I've seen it a few times. So people asking about getting started in whether cybersecurity, Mac cybersecurity from something else.
Yes.
To start, I have this lovely book behind me from No Starch Press called The Art of Mac Malware by Patrick. It is fantastic. There's another one called OSX Incident Response, I believe is the title. It's from Jaron Bradley. Those are some great books. Of course, you can watch all the Objective by the Sea talks. Oh, nice. Perfect. Oh, he's got both of them.
How I learned.
Objective by the Sea talks are all streamed on YouTube. Find some that look interesting. There are some like I think there was one last year, like my first year in Mac security and things like that. Those are all fantastic. And of course, for myself, Twitter was extremely helpful when I was getting started in this. It's a good community. You can find people to follow, read their articles. There's a lot of very talented people, whether it's Jaron Bradley over at Jamp, Phil Stokes at Sentinel One, Thomas Reed at Malware Bytes, all people who are very knowledgeable and great people.
Stuart at Huntress.
Oh, thank you. So that would be my recommendation. Patrick, do you have anything to add to that?
First, great question, and I am super stoked that you all tuned in today, but also that many of you are considering, diving into macOS. Mentioned a few times, the adversaries, their ranks are swelling, right? They are, as I've said many times, super interested in macOS, in iOS, and this is just a trend that is going to continue. Most everyone, a lot of people have iPhones. Macs are making huge inroads into the enterprise. And Jabs even made predictions that at some point there's going to be parity, equal number of Macs in Windows, which I think is right. I don't know exactly when that's going to be. So the adversaries, I said, they're like super interested in Mac. And so what we need to do is equally grow the ranks of defenders so that we can, compete and have a level playing field, because as I mentioned, a lot of times Apple does a lot of great things, but there's still a lot of gaps. And so we need security researchers pointing out flaws in their security posture, calling them out on their marketing BS. Not to like shame Apple, but to say, hey, look, the truth is a little more nuanced. And hey, by the way, you need to fix these things. You should have found them, but you didn't. But hey, at least we did before the adversary. So this gives you a chance to patch them. So welcome, join us. It's also great for job security, and it's still lots to do here. Windows is like super saturated. Finding security vulnerabilities in Windows is really difficult. On Mac, it's kind of more user friendly in a way because it's newer. Also, I think our community is awesome. So, how do you start? Great question. I'm going to shamelessly plug Objective-C. We have a great blog. We post a lot of guest blogs as well. I'm actually pushing out some in the next few days. And a lot of times when I post the blog thing, it's not like, hey, this is how cool I am. I already know I'm cool. No, kidding. It's more like, hey, this is how I went through analyzing this, for example, malware, or this is how I reverse engineered this framework. And yeah, I've been doing this for a while, but I still learn a lot. I still try things that don't work. And so I've really tried to write the blog post in a way that's like informative and educational. The book is also really good. It's The Art of Mac Malware. If you go to taomm.org or just Google it, it's 100% free online. So you can buy the printed version. All royalty payments actually go back to the foundation. So a good cause. But it's also, 100% free online. And again, it's kind of introductory. Like, yes, it dives into some deep topics, but it really provides you with kind of the walkthrough. And it's really the book that I wish I had when I started this. And so I think that's a great starting point as well. Stuart mentioned Twitter, great place. You know, Twitter, there's some challenges there, but for better or worse, it's where the InfoSec community posts a lot of their research. And the conference, the OBTS conference, also is great. There's a lot of great talks there. So I would just start there. So some great books. And also, you can always shoot me DM on Twitter, LinkedIn. I try to be pretty responsive. And I would say keep tuning into Huntress's Tradecraft Tuesdays, because you have great guests and we talk about all sorts of awesome things.
I think one of the most informative things when I was early on, you were doing Twitch streams and you were like live looking at malware.
Yeah.
And those are also on YouTube. So anyone who wants to go find those,
I could bring that back. Maybe I was just like, man,
you should.
I think I'm too old to be like a streamer. But no, those were fun. So
yeah.
maybe good. I think also the objective for the We events we'll do, I'm sure we'll post those online. The content and the talks, I think those are also focused on more, how to get interested, where to start. So there might be some neat trainings on that again, we'll try to make available. So again, great question. Definitely get involved. We need your brains. We need your numbers. And like I said, also great job security.
Yeah. And thank you, Patrick, so much. I know you're busy with already planning next year's conference and things like that.
Yes.
And I've been deep in the trenches in Huntress, planning Huntress Mac EDR and things like that. So having you here is so awesome. And I'm so appreciative of you joining us today.
Oh, thanks, Stuart. And also thanks to Huntress for hosting this. Clearly, I'm just super passionate about talking about this stuff. So for me, it's great to have a chat. Also, to answer your questions and to talk about these topics, because these topics are actually really important, right? We talked about malware spying on kids. We talked about nation states spying on other countries. Like, this isn't just hypothetical stuff. This is stuff that's really impacting people's lives. And so I think it's really important for us to dive into these topics, to welcome new people into the community, to provide mechanisms, trainings, and to focus, say, hey, if you want to join, like, this is how you can get started. So again, thank you everyone for attending. Hope to see many of you at OBTS 7, and Stuart and Huntress also, again, thanks for giving me a platform to talk to everyone and to interact with the community. I really appreciate it.
Of course, the pleasure's ours. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, for all your questions. Oh my gosh, that was fantastic. And have a great rest of your Tuesday. Thank you for being here. So long.